May I speak in the name of the Creator, Redeemer and Sustainer. Amen. Are you a sort of person who lives your life viewing it as a half-empty bottle sort of person, where you see the things that are missing, the things that you haven't got? Or are you a half-full sort of person where you are very aware of all your blessings and the benefits that you have in your life? Or maybe it depends on where you are in your life and the sort of experiences that you're having. During these months of lockdown and the pandemic, we've been increasingly encouraged to think of our own personal environment, ourselves, and the things that we're encountering on a daily basis, ways of keeping ourselves and others safe. We're being encouraged to think about who we mix with, social distancing, whether to wear a mask, whether not to wear a mask, whether using hand gel, whether to go out, whether not to go out, whether we need to isolate because we've encountered someone who is ill. We've been encouraged to think about our own personal safety and therefore the safety of others, quite rightly. But in many ways it can shrink our world down. It makes our world just being about ourselves. During the early stages of lockdown, I think like most people, we watched the daily news coverage of it. But after a while, I don't know about you, I began to wonder what was happening in the rest of the world, because it was totally dominated with what's happening here in this country, and perfectly understandable. But still, I was thinking, what's happening in the rest of the world? If we put ourselves in Jesus' time, we might be able to relate to it more closely than we have done before. During Jesus' time, survival was a daily thing. Illness and the treatment of illness was still very much a mystery. And so life every day was about survival. Finding someone who could offer help to you when you were ill was really important. So if you heard about a local rabbi who could do healing, certainly if you had a serious illness, you would go and see them. Social distancing was almost part of the culture of the Hebrew people. They had laws and regulations that were in their Torah under Leviticus and Deuteronomy, which governed the way they lived their lives. It was about interacting with God and life and mixing the two together so that everything become about life and God was intermixed. But with that, there was regulations about who you could mix with, who you could marry, kosher laws about the food that you could eat. You could become ritually unclean if you broke any of these rules. And it gave them a way of being distinctive and maintaining their distinction of their faith during a time when often the Holy Land was being occupied. So these rules and regulations which governed their lives and the social distancing that they experienced kept their distinctiveness as a faith and as a people, and it helped them survive. So during Jesus' time, survival and following these laws were really important. So let's come again to the story of what's happening today. Put yourself in that place, remembering all the things that I've just said. Jesus has taken himself off to have a bit of time on his own. Just prior to this, his cousin John was executed by Herod in a really terrible way. Jesus is mourning. He wants a bit of space to reflect, think, pray. We can understand how he might feel. And then his disciples come and tell him that people have begun to gather. People that require healing on so many different levels. People that have come to meet Jesus, to hear about him, to experience his healing. The crowds are beginning to gather and the disciples are becoming anxious as to what to do next. So they come to Jesus to fetch him. Now we'd understand it if Jesus said, well, actually, I need a bit of space and time to think about what's happened. Time to mourn the loss of my cousin. We'd all understand that, wouldn't we? But he was aware that these people had travelled from miles and miles. They'd come from their own environments. They'd come and mixed together risking everything to be with other people that might be ill, crossing all those divides, being together just to meet Jesus. So he responds with compassion and honesty and love. And he comes to meet this crowd. Well, I can't imagine what that's like. It wasn't 50, it wasn't 100, it was 5,000 people and no social distancing. So I can't imagine what that was like, but I think in many ways we better have a better understanding today. Jesus responds with compassion and understanding. He goes amongst the crowds and he brings them healing and hope. This amazing, amazing rabbi who comes from Nazareth in the form of God comes amongst them, teaching them, healing them, and giving them hope. It must have been an amazing experience. It would have been lovely to be there, even with no social distancing, to have that experience of Jesus teaching and healing. But as the day closes, the disciples realise that there's all these people there and they need to eat. So their natural response is, we're going to need to send these people away. Eastern hospitality dictates that strangers are fed. It's become their responsibility. If you look in the Old Testament to the story of Abraham and Sarah, very early on in the story, you'll find that they encounter a couple of strangers that we know as angels who come to their tent. And Abraham feeds them because this is part of their culture. They might be complete strangers. He might not know why they've come to see him, but they've arrived, and hospitality dictates that you feed them. So even though it's 5,000 people, hospitality and their culture dictates that they should do something to meet their needs, not just their spiritual and physical needs, but more to do with just being hungry. Some of them would have come with just the shirts on their back. And so hospitality dictated that they should be fed. So rather than send them away, Jesus says, how much food have we got? Well, of course, they've only got a couple of fish and some loaves, so disciples don't know what they can do with that. But Jesus knows God can create something out of nothing. He created the universe. He created human beings out of dust. For God, all things are possible. So he takes the loaves and the fishes and he blesses them. And incredibly, he is able to feed everyone. This has happened before. There's quite a few stories in our Old Testament where this sort of thing has happened. If you remember Moses out in the wilderness, when the Israelites had come out of slavery and they were trekking across the desert, they needed to be fed. And they demand food. They think about returning to Egypt because they said at least we were fed there. And so Moses employs God, and God sends manna, which is like wafers from heaven. Interestingly, the wafers only last for a day, and yet people can't resist hoarding that food. I can't help feeling that maybe some of them actually already had some food that they weren't sharing. After all, not everyone was born in the pits of slavery. They had enough gold to create a golden calf. So it does make you wonder what's going on there. They were certainly, many of them, half-empty bottle sort of person, because despite having manna from heaven, they still complained to God that there was only a vegetarian option. And so God had to send them birds or fowl to feed them so that they had meat. Can't please some people. So back to the story of Jesus and the 5,000. So he blesses the bread and the fish, and they're shared out, and everyone's fed. We're told that everyone's fed, and you can't help feeling that they're fed on different levels: healing, teaching, and of course the basic necessity of food. And we're told that at the end of all of that, there's an abundance left, 12 baskets of food. Have you ever thought about why 12 baskets? Maybe it's to do with God's abundance. When we ask of him, he showers abundance upon us. So even though they started out with so little, they fed 5,000 and they ended up with 12 baskets of food. Or maybe it relates to the listener of the time. It relates to the 12 tribes of Israel, or the new Israel and the 12 disciples. We're not absolutely clear, but it talks of compassion and abundance, the abundance of God's love. So, as we relate this story to today, all those people might not have gathered together if they were afraid. Instead, they overcome their fear because they know they can reach out to our Lord through Jesus. They come to him for healing on so many different levels and teaching. But for us, we can still feel fear. Fear is a natural part of living, but fear can dominate and stop you doing things. Fear can make our world too small. When I was in town the other day, I had an experience. I'd booked an appointment at a shop and I'd received a phone call saying that I needed to be there and that I needed to wear a face mask and I needed to be on my own. And so when I went for the appointment, I was a little bit surprised that I had to stand in a queue outside the shop. They were regulating how many people were going into the building, even though we had appointments. I felt a little bit anxious because I was wondering whether I would be in on time for my appointment, which was perfectly natural. I was about third in the queue. So I was thinking, what if I'm late? Will I miss my appointment? But then I thought, well, actually, they must have made allowances for this sort of thing. They're asking us to wait outside. And so I just settled down to wait. But there was a lady further back in the queue who was not happy about waiting. She phoned someone, and the phone call was so loud that I could hear her right near the front of the queue. And she was complaining very loudly that she had an appointment and she couldn't see why she had to wait outside the building with 6 people in front of her and why they couldn't let her in. Well, we know why they couldn't let her in and why they couldn't let me in. They were regulating the numbers inside. It was to keep others safe and to keep ourselves safe. But we don't always think of that when that's happening. Sometimes our world has shrunk down. And I think fear, maybe she was afraid of standing in the street amongst other people. Maybe she didn't feel she could control the space around her. I don't know. But she was deeply unhappy and she couldn't see the reasoning behind it. And fear governed. Over these months, we've been taught to think about ourselves, which is quite right. We need to think about ourselves, our safety and the safety of others. But I would also ask you to remember the world that's bigger than you, to think about your wider community and the world in which we live. Think about God's compassion and love, and think about how you can be generous with others. Sometimes our bottle is half empty and sometimes it's half full. We're encouraged to be compassionate and generous with others, to give of ourselves, even if it's only a small amount. We already know from the story how God can take something small and make it spread a long, long way. It can be such a generous act, even if it comes from a small amount. People have lost their jobs, their livelihoods. Cathedrals have actually laid staff off. Everyone's going through a tough time, and it's quite understandable and maybe instinctive that we all pull back and just think about ourselves. But as in our faith, we're encouraged to think of others. We're encouraged to have courage and to seek where God is in this situation. So compassion and love must dominate our lives. And fear, we need to push fear aside because fear can stop us doing things. Be safe, be careful, but be compassionate and understanding to others. My most favourite psalm is Psalm 139. It's a wonderful psalm and I encourage you to read it. It's a psalm all about reminding us that God is with us in all our experiences. God is with us during the joyful parts of our lives and the times when we feel like he's absent He's not absent at all. He's present all the time. God is present in the darkness and the light, as the psalm tells us, in life and in death. We're never on our own. He's not absent. We just can't see him sometimes. If you look at the stars at night, you see stars and blackness, and it'd be easy to think that between the stars there is nothing. But there isn't nothing. There are always things between the stars. It's just that we can't see them. God is present in our everyday life. We can't always see that he's there, but he is. He's present in the darkness and in the light, in times of plenty and in times of need. We need to respond to God's love and compassion for us by being loving and compassionate to others. So during this time when we need to be careful about who we're mixing with and about our own personal safety and the safety of others, I would encourage you to be generous and compassionate with what you have, to share with others, and be generous as God is generous with you. Amen.